Mary Tyler Moore's hand went to the edge of the desk, her face suddenly and completely drained of color, and before Johnny Carson could even rise from his chair, Dick Van Dyke was already on his knees beside her, his own famously boyish composure replaced by a raw and immediate fear that 23 million Americans could see clearly on their television screens later that night. Several people present later described this exact sequence as unfolding with a speed that left almost no time for anyone else in the studio to fully process what was actually happening before Van Dyke had already positioned himself protectively at Moore's side. It was February 14th, 1978, and earlier that evening, before a studio audience of 300 people at NBC Studios in Burbank, something happened that nobody watching the broadcast when it aired later that night ever forgot, a moment that revealed, for the first time in any public setting, exactly how seriously Dick Van Dyke had been quietly watching over his closest friend's declining health for years. Coming up, exactly what happened when Mary Tyler Moore collapsed during a taping that was supposed to be a light-hearted reunion between two of America's most beloved television partners. The specific and largely private battle with diabetes she had been fighting since 1969, and the promise Dick Van Dyke had made to her years earlier that almost nobody outside their closest circle ever knew about. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that the easy, effortless chemistry between these two beloved performers concealed a considerably more serious and more private story about friendship, illness, and quiet devotion. Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore first worked together in 1961, when Moore, then a relatively unknown 24-year-old actress, was cast as Laura Petrie opposite Van Dyke's Rob Petrie on The Dick Van Dyke Show, a pairing that neither the network nor the show's creators fully anticipated would develop into one of the most genuinely beloved and most enduring partnerships in the history of American television. Van Dyke himself, 35 years old and already an established Broadway performer at the time of the casting, later recalled his own immediate and genuine impression of Moore's considerable natural talent during their earliest rehearsals together, a specific recognition that convinced him, well before broader audiences had any opportunity to discover her themselves, that he was working alongside someone genuinely exceptional. The two performers developed, across the following 5 seasons of the program's original run, a specific and considerable chemistry that extended well beyond the screen, a genuine friendship built on mutual professional respect and, according to people who knew them both, an unusually deep personal understanding that persisted for the remainder of their respective lives. The specific origins of this chemistry deserve fuller understanding, because they illuminate exactly how genuinely close this partnership actually became during the demanding early years of their collaboration. Van Dyke, already an established performer with considerable Broadway experience, took a specific and genuine interest in helping the considerably less experienced Moore develop her own comedic timing and her own screen presence, spending additional hours beyond the production's demanding schedule working through scenes together, a mentorship that Moore, in later interviews, credited directly with helping her develop the confidence and the specific skill that would eventually make her own subsequent starring career possible. This early investment established a foundation of genuine mutual respect that neither performer's subsequent and considerable individual success ever diminished. What almost nobody in the general American public fully understood was the specific and considerable severity of the health condition Mary Tyler Moore had been quietly managing since 1969, when she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 33, a diagnosis that arrived after a routine medical examination revealed blood sugar levels considerably higher than her doctors initially wanted to believe. Type 1 diabetes, unlike the more common type 2 form of the disease, required Moore to manage her blood sugar through careful and constant insulin administration for the remainder of her life, a demanding daily discipline that she maintained privately and largely invisibly throughout the peak years of her enormously successful career, including her own subsequent starring role on The Mary Tyler Moore Show. The specific and considerable discipline this daily management required deserves fuller documentation because it illustrates exactly how demanding Moore's private reality actually was throughout the years. American audiences knew her as one of television's most consistently cheerful and most reliably composed performers. She was required to carefully calculate and administer insulin doses multiple times daily, timing these injections around her meals and her physical activity with a precision that left little room for the unpredictable demands of a demanding production schedule, frequently adjusting her management routine around early call times, long filming days, and the physical demands of performing in front of a live studio audience. Colleagues who worked closely with her during this period, largely unaware of the specific medical reality she was managing, simply understood her as remarkably disciplined and remarkably professional, never fully appreciating the considerable daily vigilance that discipline actually required. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens next reveals a private promise Dick Van Dyke made to Mary Tyler Moore years before this broadcast. The specific demands of managing type 1 diabetes in the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s deserve fuller understanding, because they illustrate exactly how considerable a private burden Moore actually carried throughout this period of her career. Blood glucose monitoring technology remained considerably more primitive than the tools diabetics would eventually have access to in later decades, meaning Moore's ability to track and manage her blood sugar levels required careful attention to diet, physical exertion, and insulin timing, without the more precise and more immediate feedback that later glucose monitoring devices would eventually provide. This meant that Moore faced a genuine and ongoing risk of dangerous blood sugar fluctuations, episodes that could arrive with relatively little warning, and that required immediate intervention to prevent genuinely serious medical consequences. Moore herself, in a later and considerably more candid interview given after her broadcast advocacy work had begun, described the specific psychological toll of living with this ongoing risk, a persistent background awareness that any given day could produce a genuine medical emergency regardless of how carefully she had planned her insulin management, a specific and exhausting form of vigilance that she said very few people without the condition ever fully understood or appreciated. She described developing, across years of managing the disease, a specific internal awareness of her own body's warning signs, though she acknowledged that these signs could sometimes progress rapidly enough that she herself failed to recognize them in time. Precisely the kind of situation where having someone else who understood the warning signs could prove genuinely life-saving. According to an account eventually confirmed by one of Van Dyke's closest friends decades later, Van Dyke had learned, sometime in the early 1970s, several years after their original series had concluded its run, about the specific severity of Moore's condition, and about several close calls she had experienced managing dangerous blood sugar episodes, information that Moore had shared with him directly during a private conversation, reflecting the specific trust that had developed between them across their years of close friendship. Van Dyke, according to this account, made Moore a specific and considerable promise during this conversation, that he would always watch for the particular warning signs of a dangerous blood sugar episode whenever they were together, having taken the time to educate himself thoroughly on the specific symptoms diabetic emergencies could produce, understanding that Moore's own considerable pride and her own careful public management of her condition meant she was unlikely to ask for help directly even when she genuinely needed it. Van Dyke's specific approach to this self-education deserves fuller documentation, because it reveals exactly how seriously he treated this particular commitment. He consulted directly with Moore's own physician, according to this account, requesting a genuinely thorough explanation of the specific physical signs that typically preceded a dangerous blood sugar episode, subtle changes in speech pattern, particular qualities of paleness or sweating, specific shifts in coordination or alertness that might otherwise be easily mistaken for simple fatigue or distraction. He reportedly took written notes during this consultation, according to the friend who eventually confirmed the account, treating the education with a specific seriousness that friends said reflected his own genuine conviction that this particular knowledge might, someday, prove to be the difference between an ordinary evening and a genuine medical emergency. Van Dyke maintained this quiet vigilance for years, according to people who observed their friendship closely, watching for subtle signs, a particular quality of distraction in Moore's conversation, a specific paleness or unsteadiness that most people would never have noticed or understood the significance of whenever the two friends spent time together at industry events or reunion appearances. Several specific instances of this vigilance eventually came to light through accounts given by mutual friends who had witnessed it directly over the years. At one industry gathering in the mid-1970s, according to one such account, Van Dyke had quietly and unobtrusively steered Moore toward a nearby refreshment table after noticing early warning signs in her conversation, engineering the specific move so smoothly that most people present never understood it as anything other than ordinary social movement, rather than a deliberate and carefully considered intervention. This particular pattern, subtle enough to preserve Moore's public dignity while still ensuring her genuine safety, characterized the entirety of Van Dyke's approach to his private commitment across the following years. This careful attention required a level of sustained awareness that Van Dyke maintained consistently across their friendship without ever making Moore feel monitored or fussed over, a specific balance that friends described as reflecting genuine emotional intelligence rather than simple worry. Johnny Carson had booked both Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore for the same broadcast to mark the considerable ongoing cultural significance of the Dick Van Dyke Show more than a decade after its original conclusion, an appearance built around warm, nostalgic conversation about one of the most beloved partnerships in American television history. Carson himself had genuine personal admiration for both performers that extended across many years of professional association, having interviewed each of them separately on numerous previous occasions and having consistently found their individual and combined charisma among the most reliably warm and reliably entertaining content the program ever featured. Carson's production team anticipated this particular joint appearance would generate exactly the kind of comfortable, nostalgic warmth that had characterized virtually every previous appearance either performer had made, an expectation that made the eventual direction of the broadcast considerably more surprising and considerably more significant than anyone walking into the studio that afternoon could have anticipated. The taping began exactly as anticipated, both performers trading warm and genuinely affectionate stories about their years working together, the studio audience delighting in chemistry that had clearly not diminished at all in the years since their original series had concluded. Nothing in these opening minutes suggested any indication of the genuine medical emergency that would soon transform the entire tenor of the evening. Roughly 22 minutes into the conversation, according to everyone present, Mary Tyler Moore's expression shifted with a specific and sudden quality that Van Dyke, according to his own later account, recognized immediately as exactly the warning sign he had spent years watching for. This specific and immediate recognition, arriving within a fraction of a second of the earliest visible symptoms, reflected years of accumulated attentiveness rather than any sudden stroke of fortunate timing. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Moore's hand went to the edge of the desk, her face suddenly and completely drained of color, her words trailing off mid-sentence as she struggled to maintain her composure in front of the cameras. Several audience members present described the specific and unsettling quality of this transition, watching a performer whose easy warmth had defined the broadcast's opening minutes suddenly and visibly struggle to complete a simple sentence. A change so abrupt that several people initially wondered whether they were witnessing some kind of unscripted comedic bit rather than a genuine medical emergency beginning to unfold in front of them. Before Johnny Carson had even fully registered what was happening, Dick Van Dyke was already moving, dropping immediately to his knees beside her chair, his own voice carrying an urgency that cut through the studio's rising confusion. Several people present specifically noted the remarkable speed of Van Dyke's response, a physical reaction so immediate and so completely unhesitating that it suggested, even before he said a single word, a level of preparedness that went considerably beyond ordinary concern for a friend experiencing sudden distress. His entire body language in this moment, according to the show's director who reviewed the footage afterward, carried none of the uncertain hesitation that typically characterizes a bystander's first reaction to an unexpected medical situation, evidence, in retrospect, of exactly how thoroughly he had mentally rehearsed this specific scenario across the preceding years. He said her name directly and firmly, the specific tone people use when trying to keep someone's attention during a genuine medical emergency, and he asked her, with a directness that revealed exactly how much private knowledge he actually carried about her condition, whether she needed sugar immediately. His voice, according to the boom microphones that captured every word clearly, carried none of the panic that might have characterized an ordinary bystander's reaction. The studio audience, according to everyone present, went from warm laughter to complete and stunned silence within the space of only a few seconds, several people later describing the specific alarm of watching a beloved and normally composed performer visibly struggling in front of them. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and genuinely frightening quality of those initial moments, several noting that the sheer speed of the transition from light-hearted nostalgia to visible medical distress made the entire situation feel considerably more disorienting than an ordinary emergency might have, precisely because nobody present had any advance warning that anything beyond ordinary warm conversation was about to unfold that evening. Johnny Carson, recognizing immediately that this was a genuine medical situation rather than any kind of scripted or comedic moment, rose from his own desk and signaled urgently toward the wings for medical assistance, while simultaneously working to keep the studio calm and focused. His own considerable experience managing countless unexpected moments across his extensive hosting career proved genuinely valuable in this exact instance, allowing him to project calm authority even as the genuine gravity of the situation became increasingly clear to everyone present. Van Dyke, remaining close beside Moore throughout this entire sequence, produced, from his own jacket pocket, a small package of glucose tablets, explaining, in the moments that followed, that he had carried these specific tablets with him at every single one of their appearances together for years, a quiet and consistent precaution that Moore herself, according to her own later account, had never fully realized he maintained so faithfully. The specific consistency of this practice deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly how genuinely sustained Van Dyke's private commitment actually was. According to his own later reflection, he had begun carrying glucose tablets in his jacket pocket following his initial conversation with Moore's physician, a habit he maintained without exception at every subsequent public appearance the two of them made together, regardless of how routine or how low risk any particular occasion might have seemed. This meant that for years, across countless industry events, interviews, and reunion appearances that both audiences and Van Dyke's own colleagues understood as ordinary professional obligations, he had quietly and consistently prepared for exactly the kind of emergency that finally materialized on that specific February evening in 1978. Moore, with Van Dyke's direct assistance, was able to address the immediate blood sugar emergency before it progressed to anything more serious, and within several minutes, color had returned to her face and her own composure had largely returned. The relief that swept through the studio in these specific minutes was, according to everyone present, palpable and entirely genuine. Johnny Carson, once the immediate crisis had passed, asked Van Dyke directly how he had known so precisely what Moore needed and how to help her so immediately. Van Dyke, according to everyone present, was quiet for a long moment before answering, and several people described a specific and unmistakable shift in his expression, his usual easy charm giving way to something considerably more vulnerable and more openly emotional. He explained, for the first time in any public setting, the private promise he had made to Moore years earlier, and the quiet vigilance he had maintained ever since, carrying glucose tablets to every appearance, watching for warning signs that almost nobody else would have recognized, understanding that Moore's own considerable pride meant she would likely never ask for this kind of help directly, even in a genuine emergency. Van Dyke elaborated further, describing the specific conversation years earlier, when Moore had first confided in him about the genuine severity of her condition, a conversation he said had fundamentally shifted his own understanding of the particular vulnerability that existed underneath her consistently composed and consistently cheerful public persona. He said that learning about her diagnosis had produced in him an immediate and genuine determination to become someone she could implicitly trust to notice what she herself might be too proud or too distracted to ask for directly, a commitment he said he had never once considered abandoning across the following years, regardless of how routine their subsequent interactions typically remained. Mary Tyler Moore, listening to this account with visible and considerable emotion, told Van Dyke and the entire studio audience that she had genuinely never fully understood, until this exact moment, precisely how much careful and sustained attention he had quietly given to her well-being across so many years of their friendship. Attention, she said she had felt in a general sense, without ever grasping its specific and considerable scope. She described, in the moments that followed, a specific memory of her own, recalling several occasions over the years when she had experienced a vague and unplaceable sense that Van Dyke seemed to be watching her with unusual attentiveness at certain moments, a sensation she said she had simply attributed to his generally warm and considerate personality without ever suspecting the specific and deliberate vigilance actually underlying it. Understanding the full truth, she said, transformed her entire retrospective understanding of their friendship, revealing a depth of quiet care that she said she felt genuinely fortunate to have received for so many years without even fully realizing it. The studio audience, having witnessed the entire sequence unfold in real time, gave both performers a standing ovation that several people present described as the most genuinely emotional response they had ever witnessed at any taping. This particular ovation, several audience members later noted, carried a specific quality distinct from the ordinary enthusiastic applause that greeted successful comedic bits or beloved celebrity reunions, something considerably closer to genuine collective relief and genuine collective gratitude for having witnessed real, unguarded human care, rather than any form of rehearsed entertainment. What followed was a considerably longer and more candid conversation than anyone had anticipated. Van Dyke and Moore discussing, with an openness neither had ever displayed so completely in any previous public appearance, the specific texture of what genuine friendship actually required across decades, and the particular significance of paying close enough attention to the people you love that you notice what they might never think to ask for directly. Moore spoke in particular about the specific psychological weight of feeling, for years, that she needed to manage her condition entirely on her own in public settings, a genuine and exhausting isolation that she said had never fully occurred to her was unnecessary until she understood in this exact moment precisely how completely and how quietly Van Dyke had actually been sharing that burden alongside her all along. Carson listened throughout with genuine and evident emotion, understanding that he was witnessing, in this exact conversation, one of the most authentically moving, unscripted moments his program had ever produced across its entire run. NBC's switchboard received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been watching genuine, unscripted care unfold between two beloved performers, alongside considerable additional interest in learning more about the specific realities of managing type 1 diabetes, a condition that received a level of public attention and public understanding following this broadcast that diabetes advocacy organizations later specifically credited with meaningfully increasing public awareness of the disease's genuine daily demands. Several of these callers specifically described their own experiences either managing diabetes personally or caring for a family member with the condition, describing a particular resonance in watching a genuine medical emergency unfold with such clarity and such compassion on national television, rather than the more sanitized or more dramatized portrayals of illness that entertainment media typically produced. One caller, a mother whose young son had recently been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, told a production staff member that watching Van Dyke's calm, practiced response had given her a considerably clearer understanding of exactly what vigilant, loving care for her own son's condition could actually look like in practice, evidence that genuine preparation and genuine attentiveness, rather than panic, represented the most effective response to the specific uncertainty her family now faced. This response echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of two beloved performers, a broader recognition among American viewers about the daily realities and daily courage that chronic illness management actually required. Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore remained close friends for the remainder of Moore's life. Their bond, already considerable before this broadcast, deepened further in its aftermath, according to people who knew them both. Mary Tyler Moore continued her considerable career for nearly 4 more decades following that broadcast, becoming, over time, one of the most prominent and most effective public advocates for diabetes research and diabetes awareness in the country, a role she specifically credited in later interviews with having its origin in the specific public attention that Tonight Show broadcast had generated. Moore's subsequent advocacy work deserves fuller documentation because it illustrates exactly how significantly that single broadcast reshaped the remainder of her public life and public legacy. She became, in the years following, a founding chairman of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation's international awareness efforts, testifying before Congress on multiple occasions regarding diabetes research funding, and speaking publicly with an openness that would have seemed unimaginable before that Tonight Show broadcast about the specific daily realities of living with a chronic and potentially life-threatening condition. She specifically credited Van Dyke's public demonstration of quiet, informed care with removing much of the private shame and private isolation she had felt managing her condition throughout the earlier years of her career, understanding, through his example, that genuine vulnerability about illness could coexist with genuine strength and genuine continued success. She died on January 25, 2017, and Dick Van Dyke, in a public statement following her death, specifically referenced their decades of friendship and the particular quality of attentive care that had defined it, describing her as one of the great loves of his life, in the truest and most complete sense of that phrase, regardless of the fact that their relationship had never been romantic. Van Dyke's statement, according to people who read it in full at the time of its release, specifically referenced the Tonight Show broadcast directly, describing it as one of the moments in his own extensive career he remained proudest of, not because of any professional achievement it represented, but because it had allowed him to demonstrate, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what genuine friendship actually required across decades: sustained attention, genuine preparation, and a willingness to act immediately and without hesitation when someone he loved genuinely needed him. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Van Dyke and Moore's remarkable friendship back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. Years later, when biographers and historians began examining the full scope of their extraordinary decades-long friendship for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified this particular broadcast as one of the clearest and most genuinely significant demonstrations available of what authentic, sustained care between friends actually looks like in practice, evidence that even the most seemingly effortless and most seemingly natural celebrity friendships often concealed genuine and considerable private effort that audiences, watching only the polished public chemistry, rarely had any opportunity to fully witness or fully understand. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the people in your own life whose struggles you might need to pay considerably closer attention to, learning the specific and quiet signs of what they need before they ever have to ask you directly. That kind of attentiveness rarely announces itself in advance, but it is almost always available to anyone willing to genuinely notice. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that genuine love sometimes looks like quiet, sustained attention rather than grand gestures. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the quiet devotion behind America's most beloved friendships. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about someone in your own life whose needs you have learned to notice before they ever have to ask. That quiet noticing, more often than not, is the truest measure of how much you actually love someone.